She helped plan every detail. She hemmed the veil, chose the flowers, even stepped aside when asked. But on the morning of her daughter's wedding, she was told, "Don't speak, just be there. No seat at the head table, no dance, no toast, not even a glance. Just a dress she didn't choose and a silence she didn't deserve." But beneath that silence, she carried a small hidden gift, a quiet offering no one saw coming. What happens when the one who gave everything is asked to disappear? And what if love doesn't need to be loud to leave the deepest mark? This is the story of a mother, erased in plain sight. The light in the hotel suite was quiet. It's the only way I can describe it. Not soft, not golden, not filtered through curtains in some romantic way, just quiet. As if it had decided not to interfere. It's a kind of light that lets a room breathe on its own. Everything had already been arranged. Dresses steamed and hanging in a neat row. Shoes lined up with surgical precision beneath each garment. Curling irons warming slowly near the vanity. A breakfast tray mostly untouched. Slices of fruit browning slightly on the edge. She was standing by the mirror, her hair half pinned, eyes focused on her own reflection. There was a steadiness in her shoulders I hadn't seen before, a quiet strength. She looked grown, sharp, around the edges, but beautiful, intentional. I was fastening a clasp on my bracelet when she said it. "You don't have to say anything during the ceremony, just be there." Her tone wasn't cruel, it wasn't even cold. It was measured. A decision spoken out loud, not a conversation open for input. I looked up, unsure if I'd heard her right. But she didn't look at me. She adjusted the neckline of her robe and tilted her head slightly, checking the angle of her jaw. Her voice had been so calm that I almost missed the request tucked inside the phrasing. "Don't speak," she meant. I nodded once. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to make her say it again. There was a version of myself that, years ago, might have asked why. Might have offered a joke, softened the edge, pretended it hadn't landed the way it had. But I wasn't that version anymore. And she wasn't a child needing comfort. She was a woman standing in front of a mirror, preparing to walk into her future. And she had just asked her mother to be invisible, not gone, not absent, just silent. I adjusted my corsage. The petals were pale blue, chosen to match the bridesmaids. She had picked the colors herself, slate, blush, and a shade of blue she called dusty sky. I had helped her narrow them down one evening after work, both of us hunched over a laptop and a pile of fabric swatches. That night felt far away now. She walked across the room and reached for her coffee, lukewarm by. Now, her face remained unreadable. No tension, no apology. Just purpose. "I just want the ceremony to feel clean," she added. Simple. Focused. I nodded again. My mouth didn't open. Not even a sound. The hairdresser entered, cheerful and oblivious, breaking the silence with a comment about the weather. It had been raining that morning, but the clouds had parted. "A good omen," she said. My daughter smiled then, not at me, just in general. It's a kind of smile brides wear when the pieces are fitting together. And for a moment, she looked soft again. Familiar, but the instruction remained. Hanging in the room like humidity. "Don't speak. Just be there." I moved to the corner of the room and picked up my shawl. Folded it again, though it hadn't been unfolded. Kept my hands busy, my breath slow. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. Just quiet. She didn't say it with malice. She didn't roll her eyes or whisper behind my back. It wasn't about punishment. It was about control, not about shaping the day in a way that made her feel safe. About removing variables. And in that moment, maybe I was a variable. It stung. Of course it did. But I had taught her to name what she needed. And today, she had asked for silence, so I gave it. I stood by the mirror for longer than necessary, pretending to adjust the bracelet she'd asked me to wear, turning it so the clasp faced down, then back up, then down again. My reflection looked back at me with a kind of stillness I didn't know I was capable of. There were words lining the inside of my mouth, not loud ones, not sharp or desperate, just the kind that sit there waiting for a place to land. I'd been collecting them quietly over the months. Tiny sentences tucked away in the corners of ordinary moments. I'm proud of you. You're braver than you know. You look like yourself. Nothing profound. Nothing that would change the course of the day, but they were mine. And I had imagined giving them to her in passing. In the hallway before the music began, while holding the hem of her dress or fixing her veil one last time. But now, they lived in a silence I hadn't chosen. Don't speak, she'd said. And so I didn't. But that didn't stop the sentences from forming. I wanted to tell her that her dress was perfect. Not because it fit or flattered or followed a trend, but because it suited her in that way you can't explain. It's that way you only see when you've watched someone grow into their own shape across decades. I wanted to say I remembered the way she used to twirl in nightgowns, too long for her arms spread like wings, asking if she looked like a bride. And how I always said yes, even when the fabric dragged and the hem came undone. I wanted to tell her I remembered the moment she first told me his name. The way her voice hesitated, just slightly, like she was testing it in the air. And how she said, he makes things feel lighter. And I smiled, even though something in me folded quietly at the edges, because I knew that lightness doesn't always last. But I also knew how much it meant to feel it while you could. I wanted to tell her that I knew today wasn't about me, that I never expected a spotlight, just a moment, a glance, a place too. Say something that didn't need to be framed or printed or quoted in a caption. Just a sentence between mother and daughter slipped into the day like a note in a lunchbox. But none of that would be said. Not now. I took my seat at the edge of the suite and watched the others move. Bridesmaids swapping lip gloss. The planner checking a clipboard for the 50th time. The stylist spraying one last strand into place. The hum of preparation filled the space like a song I no longer knew the lyrics to. She passed by me once close enough that I could have reached out and touched her hand. I didn't. I just looked up and smiled. Small, careful. She returned it, barely, and then she was gone again. Into the next moment, the next task. The next version of herself. I opened my purse and looked at the small envelope inside. I had written a card the night before. Simple, no flourish. Just a few lines. Words I'd been carrying for years and didn't know how else to say. I had planned to slip it into her hand before the ceremony. Now, 'twould stay in my bag, because I had been asked not to speak and even words written down felt like breaking a rule. There's a kind of ache that comes from withholding love, not because you want to, but because it's been gently refused. And today, she had refused the part of me that wanted to offer something real. Something small and solid in the middle of all the sparkle. So I stayed quiet and the words remained inside. Me. Not vanished. Not wasted. Just. Unsaid. It had arrived in a garment bag 2 weeks before the wedding. No note inside. Just the dress, wrapped in tissue paper. The receipt still tucked into the side seam, as if someone expected me to return it. But I did single quotes G. She said, because it photographed well. Slate blue, cap sleeves, floor length. The kind of elegant that doesn't invite commentary meant to match the flowers, the linens, the sky if it stayed clear long enough for the ceremony. It wasn't what I would have chosen, not because it wasn't beautiful, but it wasn't mine. Not the fabric I feel at home in. Not the neckline I tend to favor. It clung in places I usually soften. It draped in ways I hadn't worn since I was someone else, in a life that didn't leave room for comfort. But I didn't say that. Not when she called, excited to say it was shipping that day. Not when she asked me to send a photo once I tried it on. I did. Stood in the hallway mirror, the light too yellow, my expression too blank. I smiled for the camera anyway, and said it's perfect. Thank you for picking it. She replied with a heart emoji. Nothing more. So the dress stayed in the closet until the morning of the wedding when I took it out. I ran my fingers down the seams. The stitching was clean. Machine perfect. No phrase. No adjustments needed. Just zip and stand still. I held it up to the light, and it shimmered faintly, catching the window's reflection. It was, in every possible way, exactly what the day called for. And still, when I stepped into it, I felt like I was wearing someone else's story. Not a costume, not a disguise. Just a version of myself that belonged to someone else's imagination. There are parts of motherhood no one prepares you for. How one day they stop asking what you think looks good. How one day they dress you the way you used to dress them. How the balance shifts from shaping them to not disrupting their shape. I zipped it slowly, careful not to catch the lining. The fabric was cool against my skin, heavy enough to remind me I was dressed for something significant. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman standing there. Not because of age, not because of makeup, but because there was no trace of softness left in the silhouette. It was clean, structured, just like she wanted, downstairs. When I entered the suite, she looked up from her phone and said, "Oh good, you got it steamed." No smile. No nod of approval. Just confirmation that a task had been completed. I sat quietly by the window, hands folded over the dress. It wrinkled less than I expected. I smoothed the skirt anyway, gently tugging at the hem. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't wrong. But it wasn't me, and yet I wore it. Because sometimes love looks like wearing something you didn't choose. Sometimes love is saying, "This is fine," even when something inside you whispers, "This doesn't fit." Later, when the photographer asked for a group photo, she gestured toward me briefly. "Can you stand next to her?" Before turning back to adjust her bouquet, I stood exactly where I was told. Smiled exactly the way the day required. The dress, in photos, looked beautiful. It did exactly what it was meant to do. It made me part of the picture, without drawing attention. And in that moment, I was all she wanted me to be. Present, composed, background. Not chosen. It's chosen for. It wasn't part of the registry. She had sent that list out early, clear, efficient, digital, a collection of things that made sense. Glassware, linen sets, a mid-range air fryer. I browsed it dutifully, even added an item to my cart, but didn't check out. Not because I didn't want to give her what she'd asked for. I did. But something in me needed to give her something else. Something not requested, not approved, not filtered through group chats or Pinterest boards. So in October, long before the final dress fittings, long before I knew I would be asked not to speak, I found it. A small store, tucked between a hardware shop and a closed bakery, barely visible from the road. The kind of place that didn't advertise. No music inside, just quiet shelves. A man at the back with hands too gentle for someone his age, polishing the edge of a wooden lid. The box sat near the window. No sign, no label. Carved by hand, smooth and warm to the touch. Not lacquered. Finished enough to feel whole. It had no lock, just a delicate clasp. Inside it was lined with pale linen blue, soft, the exact color of her baby blanket from when she was still small enough to fit against my chest. I ran my fingers along the edge. It wasn't grand, it wouldn't photograph well. It wasn't the kind of thing someone posts about or displays at the bridal shower, but it held something I couldn't describe. Stillness. It's a place for things that mattered and didn't have anywhere else to go. A place for the pieces she might want to keep quietly when no one else was looking. I bought it without asking questions. Paid in cash. The man wrapped it in soft brown paper and tied it with a single strand of cotton twine. No plastic, no receipt. Just a nod between us, like he understood exactly what it was for without needing to hear a word. At home, I placed it on the guest bed and waited for weeks. I thought about how to give it, whether to include a note, whether to explain. Eventually, I wrote something small, a single card folded once for the things no one sees, the things worth keeping anyway. Love, Mom. I didn't sign my full name, didn't date it, just those words tucked inside, resting gently on the linen lining. I rewrapped it carefully, Chose different paper, this time pale gray with soft white stitching along the edges. I added a sprig of dried lavender under the knot. She used to sleep with lavender under her pillow. She said it helped her feel safe. I hoped she still did. By December, the gift sat in my closet. By February, I added a silk ribbon. By March, worried it wasn't enough. But by April, I knew. It wasn't about enough. It was about real, about quiet, about offering something that didn't require a thank you or a photo or even acknowledgement. I brought it with me to the hotel in a separate bag, wrapped again in a layer of tissue, nestled between my shawl and a travel umbrella. I didn't plan to hand it to her directly, just leave it where she'd find it, on her dresser in the suite. Or maybe outside her door. That morning, before the silence was asked of me. Before the ceremony, before this scream that would never come, I touched the corner of the wrapping one more time, and I thought, let this be what she remembers, not the speeches, not the photos, not the dress I didn't choose. Let it be this. A box, a place, a love that didn't ask to be seen but showed up anyway. It had been a Thursday, late afternoon, the kind of call that sneaks into the middle of the week without urgency but leaves a mark anyway. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting mail, a pot of water warming on the stove for tea. When her name lit up the screen, I answered on the second ring. She didn't say hello the way she used to. No hi, Mama. No pause before beginning. It's just a deep breath and then, okay. I think I've figured out the ceremony flow. I reached for a pen dot. She spoke quickly, her words already shaped by lists and timelines. There was a new plan for seating, change in the order of the readings, an update from the florist. I listened, writing notes I didn't need just to let her hear. The scratch of the pen and know I was still with her. She paused once, long enough to sip something. I heard the clink of a spoon against glass. Then she said it again. I was thinking it's probably best if you don't speak during the ceremony. It wasn't an accusation, not even a correction. It's just a decision delivered like a weather forecast. Calm, certain, out of my control. I didn't ask why, but I think she expected me to. She waited, just long enough for a reaction. I could hear her cursor clicking in the background, navigating spreadsheets and PDFs. When I said nothing, she continued. Not in a bad way. I just don't want too many voices. It gets cluttered. And I want it to feel really clean and focused. Clean. Focused, uncluttered dot. I stared at the tea bag in my hand. The way the paper tag trembled slightly before settling. I understand, I said. Because what else could I say? She filled the rest of the call with more updates. Her voice softened slightly. When she mentioned the venue, how the arch would be draped in white fabric, how the pianist had agreed to play her favorite song. She asked if I had booked my hair appointment. I told her yes. She didn't ask if I liked the dress by the end. She said thanks for being so flexible and signed off quickly. A beep. A blank screen. A silence. I sat there for a while after. The call ended. The kettle had begun to whine faintly, the water just beginning to boil. The mail remained unsorted. The pen rolled off the table and onto the floor. I hadn't cried. It wasn't that kind of wound. It was the quieter kind. The one that comes from watching your roll shrink so slowly, so politely, that by the time it disappears, you almost believe it was never yours to begin with. I had always known this day would come. The day she'd build her own frame. Her own voice, her own rhythm. And I had always told myself I'd step back with grace when it did. But I had imagined a different kind of stepping back. Not a silencing. Not a polite redirection, just space. Room for both of us. I steeped the tea slowly. Poured it into my favorite mug, one she gave me years ago, with a faded heart on the handle and a crack near the rim. It still held warmth. So did I, even after that call. Even after she asked me not to speak. Even after. I nodded into a silence she would never hear. Because the thing about mothers is we don't need to be heard to know what we mean. And we don't need to speak to still be there. The rehearsal dinner had been held in a quiet little restaurant just off the main road stone floors. Low ceilings, candlelight flickering in, pressed glass votives. The kind of place that tried to feel timeless. Everything was curated to look effortless. Though you could tell from the way the waitstaff moved that nothing about it was improvised. I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of nervousness, but habit. I had helped confirm the reservations weeks before, sent over the menu preferences, even reminded the planner about the dietary needs of her cousin with the almond allergy. I didn't expect applause, but I thought maybe someone would nod. Someone might say, "There's your seat," right up front. But when I walked into the private room, my name wasn't on the table. Not on a card, not on a napkin, not on the small handwritten seating chart. Propped beside the hostess stand, I scanned the room once, then again. A flicker of unease rose and settled without showing on my face. I didn't want anyone to notice. The tables had already begun to fill. Laughter curled between wine glasses. A group of bridesmaids posed for a picture near the fireplace. Father was at the head table, of course, his wife beside him. The groom's parents flanked the other side. My daughter, radiant in a soft green dress, stood laughing beside her maid of honor. There was no space for me there, not because the room was full, but because the table was already complete. A server passed by with a tray of chilled glasses, smiled and stepped aside, said nothing. Eventually, someone from the planning team noticed me hovering. She offered a quick, quiet gesture to a table toward the back, near the kitchen entrance. "You can sit here," she said gently. "So sorry for the mix-up." It wasn't a mix-up. I knew that this was a decision. Quiet, subtle, intentional. The table I was directed to had 3 other people already seated, distant relatives of the groom, if I remembered correctly. They nodded politely, introduced themselves with practiced warmth. One of them mispronounced my last name. I corrected it softly, then waved it off with a smile. We all had our lines to deliver that night. The bread arrived. Few speeches began. I watched from the edge of the room as stories were told about childhood, about first meetings, about how we got here. I lifted my glass when prompted. I laughed in the right places. I did not interrupt. She didn't make eye contact with me all evening. Not once she looked toward the camera when it was time. She looked at her father when he toasted. She looked at the candles, the guests, the groom, but not me. It wasn't coldness, wasn't cruelty, it was choreography, and I had already missed. They cued at one point. The photographer moved around the room for candid shots. He lifted the camera slightly when he passed my table, then seemed to hesitate. Maybe he didn't know who I was, or maybe he did. Either way, he moved on. The room carried on without me. Plates cleared. More wine poured. People rose to mingle. Someone played a song on the piano, tucked near the bar, and the sound melted into the clinking of cutlery and soft applause. I sat still for a while longer, folded my napkin carefully, thanked the server when dessert arrived, ate 3 bites of cake I didn't taste. Then I rose quietly, gathered my things, and stepped into the hallway. No one followed, no one noticed, and that night when I returned to my hotel room, I opened the program draft for the wedding and saw that my name was still printed there, mother of the bride, right beneath a paragraph. I had helped write, but names on paper don't set the table, and sometimes there is no place card waiting. She moved through the evening with ease, the kind of ease that comes from being sure of your place in the story. Every time I looked toward the center of the room, she was there standing beside the groom, one hand lightly on his back, the other gently steadying her wine glass. Her voice was warm, her dress elegant but unremarkable, chosen for confidence rather than attention. The groom's mother. I had met her a handful of times, always polite, always soft-spoken. She sent cards on birthdays, never forgot anniversaries. The kind of woman people call gracious without really knowing why. That night, she was everything a room like that rewarded. She complimented the floral centerpieces, so tasteful, don't you think? okay? And helped a guest find their six-beater. Misplaced purse. She leaned in when people spoke. She laughed lightly and often. She toasted with the groom's father during his speech, lifting her glass with practiced timing. When the photographer circled back around for candidates, she turned, naturally toward the lens. Every time she smiled, someone responded, and when my daughter looked at her, there was light. Not the kind reserved for family, but the kind reserved for people who never disappoint. I watched her fold a napkin back into its perfect shape after catching a spill. I watched her touch the groom's arm when he looked nervous. I watched my daughter brush past her on the way to the restroom and pause briefly to squeeze her hand. It was a gesture I recognized because once she used to do. That to me, she had found something in that woman that made her feel steady. Maybe it was the structure, the predictability, the way she seemed to always have the right-sized earrings and the right kind of shoes. Or maybe it was just the absence of history between them. A relationship built in the present, unburdened by memory. There's something intoxicating about a blank page. And I, her mother, was written in ink. When they posed for photos, I watched from the back of the room. I saw my daughter turn toward the groom's mother and say something, laughing softly. They linked arms. Photographer clicked. She didn't call me over. I didn't expect her to, but I felt the moment settle. It's like furniture rearranged without permission. Everything still intact, just in a new configuration I hadn't chosen. Later, when the speeches began, the groom's mother stood to speak. Her voice was clear, practiced, but not rehearsed. She told a story about him as a child. Scraped knee, a lesson in kindness. She said, I always hoped he'd find someone gentle, someone who knows how to listen. She looked at my daughter then and smiled. My daughter smiled back, a full smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. The guests applauded. I did too, because that's what you do when you've been asked not to speak. You clap for the people who still get to be heard. I never resented her. The other mother. I didn't blame her for the ease, the place, the light, but I watched it closely because there's a quiet shift that happens when you see your role played by someone. Else then, no one in the room notices the replacement. Afterward, she made her way through the crowd, thanking guests, hugging cousins, fixing place cards that had fallen. She passed by me near the exit and smiled warmly. Lovely dinner, she said. Her voice was soft, her eyes kind. I nodded. Yes, it was. She didn't know where I had been seated. She didn't ask. And maybe that was grace, or maybe it was omission. Either way. I stepped aside and she kept moving through the center of a celebration that used to have room for me. IT sat folded in the drawer beside my bed for nearly 3 weeks before the wedding. Just 3 paragraphs, handwritten, not poetic, not rehearsed. The kind of letter you write in one sitting, and your hands know what your voice wouldn't dare say aloud. I hadn't meant to write it, but the night I did, the house had been too quiet. The lights in the kitchen hummed low. The tea had gone cold, and the planning call from earlier that afternoon still echoed in my ears. Just don't speak during the ceremony. Just be there. I kept hearing that one sentence, turning it over like a stone in my pocket. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt, not in a sharp, obvious way. But something had shifted, a gentle boundary. Drawn in chalk, I could still attend. I could still wear the dress she'd chosen. But my voice had been excused from the room. So I wrote the letter. I used the stationery I kept for sympathy notes. Ivory with a blue-gray border, heavy enough to feel like something. I didn't start with dear. I didn't sign with love. It was just her name at the top and my name at the bottom, with a space between us filled by the things I couldn't say that day or maybe ever. I told her how proud I was, not just of the wedding or the choices that brought her there, but of the person she had become in all the in-between moments. The moments she didn't think I saw. It's the ones she never mentioned, but carried like a quiet ache her first job. The night she got her heart broken and didn't call. It's the time she moved apartments alone. I told her I remembered the version of her that danced in the kitchen to songs she didn't know the words to, that wore mismatched socks and never made her bed, that once said, "Mom, I don't want to be anything but myself." And I told her she had succeeded. I didn't apologize. Not because I had nothing to apologize for, because I knew what apologies could do to a day like this. I didn't want to turn her wedding into a reckoning. I didn't want her to think I needed anything from her except peace. I just wanted her to know that I had loved her every version. That was all. When I finished writing, I read it once, quietly, under the kitchen light. Then I folded it twice neatly, carefully unplaced it in an envelope without sealing it. I slipped it into the drawer beside my bed and left it there. I had planned to give it to her the morning of the wedding. Thought I might place it beside her bouquet or tuck it into her overnight bag, something she'd find later, when the noise had faded and she was alone. A letter for the in-between. It's the after. But when I arrived at the hotel suite, she was already in motion, already surrounded, already glowing in the way brides do when everything is aligned exactly as they've imagined. And I was not part of that vision. Not that morning, so I left the letter where it was, still in the drawer, still, unsealed, still waiting. Back home after the wedding, I opened it once more, reread the words, wondered if they still applied. Wondered if they ever did. The ink had held steady, no smudges, no edits. Just the truth laid bare in my own handwriting. I folded it again, slid it back into the envelope, and this time I sealed. It not to send, not to deliver just to keep, because some letters don't need to be read. They just need to be written. The room was full before the door, even finished swinging shut behind me. Steam from the curling irons mixed with the perfume that lingered in the corners. Laughter was already bubbling from the couch where the bridesmaids sat cross-legged, sipping from champagne flutes with gold-rimmed edges. Someone was FaceTiming, an aunt who couldn't make it. Someone else was adjusting a playlist. She looked radiant, of course. Her robe was white, not satin, but cotton soft, crisp. The monogram on the pocket barely visible unless the light caught it just right. She was barefoot, sipping something pale from a glass with a strawberry floating inside. Her hair had been pinned halfway up already, soft waves cascading over one shoulder. She turned when I entered, offered a quick smile, not warm, not cold, just polite, and then went back to whatever conversation she'd been mid-sentence in. The makeup artist was busy at the main vanity, blending foundation on someone's cheek with swift, practiced strokes. A second stylist was already unpacking brushes near the window. I stood for a moment near the door, unsure where to place my purse, unsure if I needed to ask or wait. No one looked up to ask if I had an appointment time. No one asked what I needed done. Eventually, I crossed to the far corner where a smaller mirror had been set up more decorative than useful and quietly unzipped my own cosmetic pouch. I had brought the essentials. I knew better than to assume I'd be on the schedule. I applied my foundation slowly, smoothed the lines under my eyes. I blended in the way I had taught her one small circles, soft edges. She used to watch me from the side of the tub, a brush in her hand, mimicking each motion with the seriousness only a child can bring to pretend. Now she sat on a high stool, her makeup being done by someone younger, someone more polished, someone who called her babe and dabbed setting powder beneath. Her eyes like it was sacred work. A bridesmaid caught my gaze in the mirror. "Do you want me to ask if you're next?" she said, kind, but distracted, already turning back before I could answer. "No, I'm fine," I replied. I brought my own. I watched myself carefully as I finished my makeup. It looked fine, appropriate. It's a kind of makeup meant to blend in, not stand out. I didn't attempt anything dramatic. No bold lip. No shimmer. Just enough to not be asked if I was tired in the photos. I reached into my bag and found the lipstick she used to borrow from me. A soft mauve worn to a stub. I nearly used it, then stopped. I chose another one she had picked for me last Christmas. Pale pink, barely a tint, It's age-appropriate, she had said, not unkindly. It's practical. I applied it without a mirror. My dress hung on the back of the door, still untouched. I waited until the room quieted slightly before slipping into the bathroom. The zipper was smooth. The fabric folded the way it was meant to. When I emerged, she glanced over briefly. "You look nice," she said. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't familiar. Either it was something in between. The photographer arrived shortly after. They rearranged the furniture to make room. She posed with her bridesmaids. They laughed, adjusted their robes, linked arms, made funny faces. Someone sprayed a mist of setting spray in the air, and it drifted across the room like invisible confetti. I stepped back toward the window, watched, blotted my lipstick once more. No one asked if I was ready. No one needed to, because I was not part of the timeline, and was not part of the lookbook. I was the mother of the bride, present, composed, complete, and silent. It was small, tucked beneath the lining near the hem, barely visible unless you were looking for it, but I saw it. Or maybe I felt it before I saw it. That instinct mothers keep long after their children stop asking for help, the ability to sense what's slightly off. Even when everyone else sees only perfection, her dress had arrived months earlier. She had picked it with her maid of honor during a weekend trip to a boutique she'd read about online. I hadn't been invited. She sent me photos afterward, grainy and backlit, her face slightly turned away from the camera. I said yes. The text read, replied with a heart dot. Now on the morning of her wedding, the dress hung in the hotel suite, suspended from the arch of the window like something waiting for a benediction. The veil rested across the back of a chair, shoes beneath, lipstick tubes, safety pins, and bobby pins, scattered like confetti across the vanity. Everything had its place, even in the chaos. I was the one who noticed the thread. It dangled fine and pale, a whisper of fabric unraveling at the edge of something sacred. No one else saw it. The photographer was snapping flat lays. The bridesmaids were trying not to spill champagne on the robes they'd only wear once. The stylist was brushing out curls with gentle precision. And she, my daughter, was laughing, softly with her back turned. I didn't announce it, I didn't ask permission. I simply found the small sewing kit I always carry. A habit. A leftover instinct. I sat at the edge of the settee, lifted the fabric carefully into my lap, and found the place where the hem had loosened. 3 inches of thread undone. Not enough to ruin the dress. It's just enough to catch on something. Later, enough to distract, to snag. I threaded the needle without needing to look twice. The motions came back easily. My hands moved the way they did when she was 7, and her recital costume tore 5 minutes before curtain. Or when she was 16, and the strap of her prom dress snapped an hour before her date arrived. My fingers remembered even when the rest of me wasn't asked to. I didn't rush. The stitch was small, invisible from the outside. A quiet correction. She passed by once while I worked, lifting her veil to her shoulders. She didn't notice what I was doing. Or if she did, she didn't ask. She adjusted her bracelet, took another sip from her glass, and turned toward the mirror again. When I finished, I smoothed the dress down gently, the thread tucked back where it belonged. Nothing flashy, nothing anyone would comment on later. Just whole again. I returned the sewing kit to my purse. No one noticed it had been used. No one asked why the thread spool had shifted or where the thimble had gone. The bridesmaids gathered again for photos. Someone shouted for tissues. Someone else retouched lipstick, and she kept smiling. There's a kind of love that doesn't announce itself. That doesn't get folded into speeches or captured in pictures. That moves in silence, mending hems, adjusting veils, brushing lint from the back of a dress no one else will notice. That morning, she looked perfect. And she was, because I had stitched the moment back together, quietly, without credit, without fanfare, without saying a word. It wasn't large. Simple cream-colored box, no ribbon, no tag. It's tied closed with string, the kind used in bakeries or antique bookshops. I had chosen it deliberately unremarkable from the outside. Something that could be missed. That was the point. It wasn't meant for the ceremony, not the reception either. It wasn't part of the plan or the itinerary or the photo sequence. It was for her. And it was for a moment I couldn't predict. I had kept it with me all morning, tucked carefully into the bottom of my tote, between my backup shoes and the packet of tissues I knew no one would ask for, between the lipstick I'd used and the one I wanted to. It sat there quietly, waiting. Like me, inside the box was something old, something she had once touched. Not an heirloom in the formal sense, nothing passed down in velvet, but something I had saved, not knowing why. A pressed flower, brittle at the edges, wrapped in wax paper. A scrap of handwriting, once hers, where she had written, "I love you," in crooked purple marker. A ticket stub from a school play where she stood 3 rows back in a cardboard tree costume, and a photo. Just one. A small, matte finish square from a time before filters and framing apps. She couldn't have been more than 5. She was in a raincoat, red, holding a paper umbrella she had painted herself. One boot lifted mid-step as if dancing. I had taken it from the front porch, crouched low behind the potted mums. I had chosen these things not for their sentimental weight, but because they were quiet. Because they had waited like I had, unspoken, unremembered, but real. There was also a note, not a letter. Not like the one I hadn't given her before. This one was briefer. Just a few lines. You don't have to remember it all. Just know that I did. Every bit. Even the things you forgot. Especially those. I didn't sign it, not with my name, just Mom, not the stylized version in cards. Not the formal mother of the bride they'd printed in the program. Just the word she used before memory started editing things. I didn't plan when I would give it to her. I thought, maybe after the ceremony when the photographs had been taken. When the shoes started to pinch and her smile began to wilt. Maybe at the reception before the dance with her father, when she might need to sit for a moment in quiet. Maybe I'd hand it to her and say, "Open it when you're ready." Maybe I wouldn't say anything at all. But the moment didn't come, not in the way. I imagined the ceremony passed like a draft through a window, brief and perfectly contained. Her vows were beautiful. His were steady. The guests applauded at all the right times. I stood when asked. I sat when cued. I watched without blinking. I did not speak at the reception. Her table was full. She moved from guest to guest, hands outstretched, laughter layered over music. I held the box in my bag until the music slowed, and the lights dimmed and people began talking in quieter tones. I found a moment, not big, just wide enough. I approached her as she stood near the cake table, waiting for someone to light the candles. She turned when I stepped forward, surprised but not startled. "I have something for you," I said. She looked down at the box, then back at me. "What is it?" "Just something small," I said. "Don't open it now." She nodded slowly, took it without hesitation, tucked it under her arm. Someone called her name and she turned. She was smiling again. Someone handed her a knife. Flashbulbs went off. The music lifted and I stepped back. I don't know when she opened it. I don't know if she ever did. But I gave it to her quietly, and that was enough. The lights dimmed slightly, just before the announcement. The DJ's voice softened, respectful, as he called them forward to the center of the room. And now a special moment, the father-daughter dance. Applause, brief and warm, rose from the tables around us. Chairs slid back, guests turned their heads, cell phones lifted into the air. She stepped out from behind the cake table, her dress catching the light in soft waves, her expression composed, lips gently parted in a breathless smile. Her father met her halfway. He looked proud, upright in the way that men carry themselves when asked to play a role they understand. He offered his hand and she took it without hesitation. They moved slowly toward the open space between the tables. The music began. Not loud, not modern, one of those songs chosen more for tone than lyrics. something safe, something timeless. They began to sway, her left hand on his shoulder, his right hand around her waist, carefully placed, respectful. Neither of them said anything for the first few seconds. He was counting steps in his head. She was probably scanning the room. I watched, from my seat at the far edge of the dance floor. Not from jealousy, not from grief. I had known he would get this moment, that he would be called forward, that she would rest her head on his shoulder, however briefly, that people would smile and say how sweet it was, and it was sweet. They looked comfortable together. Not overly close, but familiar. Years of drop-offs and check-ins and missed birthdays that had still managed to keep them tethered. He had not always been there, but he had always been hers. A few people began whispering. At nearby tables, someone leaned over to say how beautiful her dress was. Someone else took another photo, and I remained still, hands folded neatly on my lap, watching them turn in a slow circle dot. At one point she laughed quietly, something he said, or maybe nothing at all, and he smiled. A smile I recognized, one he used in photographs where he didn't know how to pose. They looked almost natural together in that moment, almost cinematic. The music swelled briefly, the kind of rise in melody designed to signal that the moment was nearing its end. She turned slightly, adjusting her position, and for a brief instant her eyes met mine across the room. It wasn't long, not enough to read, but she saw me. Know that? I nodded. She didn't nod back, but her gaze didn't flick away immediately either. Then the song ended. Applause again. He kissed her forehead brief. A cautious hand. They parted. She returned to the table with the bridesmaids. He stepped back into the crowd. I stayed in my seat. No one had asked me to dance. No one needed me in that part of the evening. That was fine. I understood how stories are arranged. Roles are written. Some mothers hold the bouquet. Others hold the silence. I watched as the next song played, something livelier now. Couples began to filter onto the dance floor. Shoes were exchanged for flats. Jackets were draped over chairs. And the space filled again with motion. Later, when she passed by my table on the way to the restroom, I stood to let her by. We were close for a moment, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the faint scent of gardenia and something sharper beneath. She didn't say anything, neither did but she looked back once before the door closed, and I wondered, not for the first time, what she remembered. What part of the story she had decided to carry into this new chapter, and what part had been left behind, folded, filed, or rewritten. Because memories can be reassembled, and sometimes dances can be choreographed. Around absences, not presence. The clinking of glasses came first light, scattered, playful. Then a few louder knocks, spoons against champagne flutes, prompting laughter from the tables nearby. It was the signal everyone expected, the one rehearsed at a dozen weddings. Time for the bride to speak. She stood slowly, gracefully, and someone handed her a wireless microphone. The room settled into a hush almost immediately. Chairs adjusted, conversations dropped. Waiters paused in the aisles. Her groom touched her hand briefly before sitting, giving her the space. She looked radiant, of course. That glow that comes not just from the dress or the makeup, but from having the room arranged around you. Every eye waiting, every breath on pause. She didn't appear nervous. She smiled and scanned the crowd as if drawing it in, measuring the moment. I wasn't going to say anything tonight, she began, pausing with a practiced sort of laugh. But when do you get to stand in a room like this, surrounded by everyone who helped make you who you are? Soft applause. Nods. A couple guests murmured their agreement. She went on to thank the guests, the bridal party, her husband, and his family. Each name or group earned a laugh or a cheer. It was light, warm, just the right tone. She thanked her father, too, for always being steady, even when we weren't always close. A few people smiled in his direction. He gave a small wave. Clearly moved, she turned toward her husband again. "You've shown me what gentleness looks like," she said. What partnership feels like when it's not effortful. You remind me every day that love doesn't need to be loud to be real. Applause again. Louder this time? Phones raised to catch a photo or video. Then her voice shifted. And I want to thank my mom. I hadn't expected it. Not really. I'd prepared myself for omission. For a quiet space in the speech where my name would not land. But she said it, and the room stilled again. For teaching me a lot about love. About boundaries. About the kind of strength that doesn't always speak. I watched her closely. Her voice was steady, her eyes not searching the crowd. We don't always understand each other, she said, pausing. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's part of it. I think we all carry parts of our parents that we don't notice until we're building something of our own. There was no applause this time. It's just stillness. She didn't cry. She didn't falter. Her words didn't feel like an invitation or a reconciliation. They felt like a naming. Like an acknowledgement placed gently in the air, not for validation. Not for closure, but because the shape of the room required it. She closed the speech with another toast to her husband. Her voice lifted again. People clapped. Some cheered. The moment dissolved back into celebration. She handed the microphone to the DJ and returned to her seat. Her bridesmaids reached for her hands. Her groom kissed her cheek. The music resumed. Waiters began to circulate again with cake. I didn't move. I didn't clap. But I had heard every word. And it didn't hurt the way I thought it might. It didn't heal anything. Either, but in a room where my presence had felt like a placeholder. She had spoken my name. Not with warmth, not with regret. But with clarity. And sometimes that is its own kind of offering. Not wrapped in a bow, not printed in the program, just said aloud, once. Quietly in front of a room that had not expected it. My place card had been. They're all a long simple ivory, black ink, curled edges. Mother of the bride. No first name, no last. Just a title. Just a role. The table was near the exit. Not at the front, where family usually sits beside the head table. Not near the dance floor, where speeches and laughter gather in waves. Mine was a quiet corner. One of those tables that's not quite forgotten, just out of the way. A place for distant cousins, co-workers who are SVPD late. Guests who wouldn't notice they weren't meant to see everything. It was round, dressed in linen, small candle. At the center, flickered with the draft from the hallway. I didn't mind, not really. I've always preferred the edges. You can see more from there. You notice the little things, the shoes? Guests change into under the table. The slight falter in a server's tray. The way someone's hands tremble when giving a toast, they didn't. Rehearsed out at my table sat a great aunt I hadn't seen in a decade. A neighbor of the groom's family and a +1 who spent the entire dinner texting. No one asked me how I was feeling. No one asked about my dress. Though I had spent days altering the sleeves just right, threading in a stitch of blue along the hem like tradition asked. I ate quietly. Chicken, lukewarm, vegetables that had steamed too long. I took small bites and smiled when someone made a comment about the centerpiece. From my seat, I could see her perfectly, not blocked by a column. Not too far to make out her expressions. She laughed often. Her teeth flashed like they used to when she played dress-up. In the hallway mirror, she didn't glance toward my table. Not once. At one point, the photographer made a round of the tables, snapping candids. When she reached mine, she hesitated just for a moment. She took a photo of the gray taunt, another of the groom's neighbor, mid-laugh. Then she lowered the camera slightly, her eyes meeting mine. I smiled politely. She didn't take the picture, and then she moved on. The music swelled again. The cake had been cut. The floor was full now. Children weaving through adults, shoes off, energy uncontainable. Her gown moved like water across tile. I remained seated. My heels pinched, but I didn't take them off. Not yet. There's a dignity in staying upright even when you're tucked behind the exit sign, even when no one's watching. Someone offered coffee. I declined. My cup from earlier was still half full. I reached into my purse at one point and touched the edge of the envelope. Again, not the gift box, but the letter I never gave her. Folded once, no address. It's just a few words written in the early morning before the suite had filled with stylists and music and perfume. It's words I had meant to offer as a mother, not as a guest. But there hadn't been a moment. And maybe there wouldn't be, so I kept it folded. The candle at the center of our table flickered again, stretching shadows across the linen. No one noticed when I stood to stretch my legs. No one paused to ask where I was going. I walked slowly to the restroom, past other tables, past warmth and movement and silverware clinking. I looked at her once more, just briefly, still glowing, still. Surrounded dot, and then I returned to the table by the exit, sat back down, folded my hands, and waited. It came during one of those soft lulls, in a wedding the kind that happens after the main toasts, after the cake has been cut but before the final songs begin to play. It's a kind of moment where people start to loosen their collars, where conversations grow quieter, and where the music dips just enough that you can hear clinking forks and tired laughter. I returned to my table by the exit with no fanfare. My chair was still slightly warm from where I had left it. A small, half-eaten piece of cake remained on my plate. Someone had refilled my water glass. The woman beside me, the groom's neighbor, had been silent most of the evening. She wore a pale blue dress and had a voice like linen, soft, easy to overlook. She had smiled politely when we were introduced, made small talk about the weather, and then retreated into silence, occasionally glancing toward the dance floor as if waiting for a familiar face to pull her in. She turned toward me after a long pause in our shared silence. "Are you the bride's mother?" It wasn't an accusatory question, not overly curious, just direct, the way only a stranger can ask. I nodded. "Oh," she said softly. "I wasn't sure. That was all. No follow-up. No elaboration, but it stayed with me. I wasn't sure. Not because of how I looked, not because of where I sat, but because in the architecture of the evening there had been no clear sign, no speech, no dance, no candle lit in my name, no whispered thank you that reached the microphone. She couldn't be blamed. She hadn't seen me walk with my daughter as a toddler, teaching her to step across stones at the park. She hadn't heard the long conversations or the silence that followed them. She hadn't seen me hem the veil the night before, my stitches precise even though my eyes ached. She didn't know that I had stayed late at fittings, adjusted her straps, let her cry when decisions overwhelmed her, that I had paid for the dress quietly through split payments and sacrifices she didn't need to know about. That I had made sure her grandmother's pin was secured beneath the bouquet, even when no one remembered it was missing. To her, I was a quiet woman at a peripheral table, in a taupe dress that didn't match the bridal party, with no role in the festivities beyond attendance. And she wasn't wrong. I smiled. Yes, I'm her mother. She tilted her head slightly, surprised. She looks very happy. She does. Another pause. You must be proud, she added. I looked at my daughter across the room. Her head was tilted back in laughter, eyes half closed, arms wrapped around the groom as they danced to a slow song that sounded vaguely familiar. I am, I said, and I meant it, even through the ache, even through the distance, even through the small erasures that had chipped away at the day like water smoothing stone, because she was happy, because she had chosen joy, even if she had written me out of parts of it. The woman beside me smiled, again kindly, and turned back to her dessert. The conversation faded as quietly as it had begun. The music lifted. Guests returned to the floor. A toddler ran past, holding half a cracker, and I sat in my chair, hands resting gently on my knees. Still, the mother, even if no one else was sure it, sat on a table just outside the ballroom doors, overlooked by most, framed by votive candles and a small spray of white roses. A pen lay neatly across its open page, half full with swirling signatures, brief messages, and the looping cursive of people who still wrote with care. I noticed it as I was preparing to leave, not because I had planned to sign it, but because it was the first time I had been alone near it. Earlier in the evening, the table had been crowded. People lined up after the ceremony, smiling, waiting their turn to write some version of congratulations or love. Notes for the couple to read later, long after the flowers had wilted and the dress had been cleaned. Notes meant to outlast the day. No one had asked me to sign it. I had walked past it at least twice without stopping. But now, as the music faded into another slow number and the hallway outside the ballroom emptied, I stood in front of it with my coat draped over one arm and my purse looped over the other. The pen was heavier than I expected. Gold-toned, smooth. The kind they buy in sets, meant to match. I flipped back a few pages. Messages were brief, sweet, predictable. So happy for you both. Wishing you a lifetime of joy. Love always wins. No one mentioned the hard parts. The stretch between silence and forgiveness. The layers we carry into love from the people who raised us. The parts of ourselves we lose and find again. I hovered over a blank line. I thought of writing something simple, safe, a generic blessing that wouldn't stand out, wouldn't complicate the memory. Something like, wishing you light and laughter, or may today be the start of everything. But the pen didn't move. Instead, I thought of all the words I hadn't said, the ones I had swallowed quietly during dress fittings, during phone calls where her voice was clipped, during conversations that felt more like assignments than exchanges. The words I had measured carefully, worried they'd take up too much space. And then slowly I wrote, I was here. Nothing more, not love, not advice, not even my name, just the truth of it. I was here. I stood in the morning light while you zipped your dress. I stepped back when asked, adjusted your veil when no one noticed, and clapped at the right times. I watched you laugh, watched you dance, watched you begin again. I didn't say it aloud. I didn't need to. The page now held it for me. I closed the book gently, careful not to smudge the ink. The candles flickered slightly as I turned. A gust of air moved through the hallway as the ballroom doors opened and closed behind someone. I stood for a moment longer, coat still draped, watching the door. Then I walked slowly down the corridor, past the mirrored walls and flower arrangements, toward the elevator. No one called after me. No one stopped me. And that, too, was part of the story. The car was already waiting by the time I stepped out into the roundabout. A long black sedan, the kind that draws attention. Just the kind that blends in. The kind used for occasions where quiet departure is preferred. The night air was cool, crisp, even. The kind of cool that settles against the skin after hours spent indoors beneath soft lighting and background music. The kind of air that reminds you the day is, in fact, over. The driver opened the door without speaking. I nodded, murmured a quiet thank you, and slid inside. The leather seats were cold. I adjusted my coat around me as the door shut with a solid click behind me. The ballroom lights were still visible through the hotel's tall windows. I could see shapes moving inside shadows, crossing behind sheer curtains. Arms lifting in dance, silhouettes pausing for photographs. The music, muffled by glass and distance, still carried a rhythm. She was still in there, laughing, I imagined. Posing beside friends from college, leaning into her new husband's shoulder. Maybe even opening the gift box I'd handed her. Or maybe not yet. I didn't know. The driver asked if I wanted the radio on. I shook my head. We pulled away slowly, the tires rolling over loose gravel and fallen petals. I watched the entrance disappear behind us, the lights softening, becoming smaller and smaller in the side mirror until they vanished completely. The road home was quiet. Streetlights passed in even intervals, casting slow-moving shadows across. The dashboard, traffic was light. It's just a few cars heading somewhere else. No horns. It's no rush. I leaned my head against the window. My hair was pinned loosely now. A few strands had fallen. I hadn't touched up my lipstick since before the reception. There was a faint ache in my heels. though I'd already slipped them off in the back seat. The silence inside the car was not uncomfortable. It felt earned. The kind that comes after a long-held breath is finally released. I thought of the speech, of the way she had said, "My mom." I thought of the stranger's question, thought of the guest book, of the single line I'd written, "I was here," and now I wasn't. I wondered what part of the night she would remember years from now. If she would recall who sat where, she'd remember that I had not danced, not once. She'd remember the box, the pressed flower, the note inside. If she'd ever ask why I didn't speak, the car turned down a familiar road. Street names I hadn't read in years past, like markers in the dark. My house would be quiet when I returned. No one waiting. Inside, just a kitchen light I'd left on by habit. Just the faint smell of lavender from the sachets I still tucked into the closet corners. The driver slowed as we neared the driveway. I reached into my purse, fingers brushing the folded letter, once more the one I never gave her. Still sealed? Still waiting. I left it inside. The door opened. Cool air rushed in again. I stepped out, heels dangling from one hand, coat slipping from my shoulder. I thanked the driver softly and watched the taillights disappear into the curve of the road. The house stood still. No music. No light shifting, just a quiet door and an older lock and the weight of the evening behind me. I stepped inside and closed it gently. It was late when I finally removed the corsage. The hotel lights had long faded from the sky behind me. Teals were near the door, my coat draped across the back of a chair. The living room held that familiar hush, the kind reserved for after events. After noise, after company, after someone else's moment. The corsage lay gently against my wrist, still fastened by the ribbon I had tied that morning. Its petals were slightly wilted now, the edges beginning to turn in. But the color was still bold. A deep rust-red rose, surrounded by sprigs of babies. Breath and 2 pale green leaves. It didn't match the rest of the wedding. The bridesmaids had worn blush pink. The table settings were ivory and gold. The bouquet had been white ranunculus and pale peonies, chosen during a long call where she had shown me dozens of pictures. She had been clear about her palette, muted, soft, neutral. But I had chosen rust-red dot, not out of defiance, not to stand out, but because it reminded me of the dress she wore when she was 10, the one she insisted on wearing for 3 months straight. Even when it was too cold, even when it no longer fit. 'Cause it matched the first lipstick she stole from my purse. Because it reminded me of the autumn day I found her asleep in the leaves after reading in the yard for hours. It was not a perfect match. It was a memory. Pinned in place. I unclipped it carefully. The ribbon released with a faint whisper. I held the flower in my palm, turning it slowly. A petal fell, curling inward as it landed on the counter. There had been a moment during the ceremony, brief, almost imperceptible, when her eyes had flicked toward the corsage. I saw it, a twitch in her expression. Not disapproval, not quite confusion, but a recognition that it didn't belong to the planned image. No one else seemed to notice, but I had, and she had. She never mentioned it, maybe she never would. I set the corsage gently into a shallow dish beside the sink. Not to keep forever, just for the night. Just so it didn't go straight into the trash. Just so there was one more moment of stillness before it became something past tense. There's a kind of quiet ache in noticing the things that don't match. The things that fall slightly outside the frame. The mother who isn't quite included. The flower that isn't quite the right shade. But there is dignity, too, in offering something quietly. In wearing a color that means something, even if it means it only to you. I poured myself a glass of water. The house was still silent. No texts had come through. No photos had been sent. I didn't expect them. I carried the glass to the bedroom and set it on the nightstand. My dress was still zipped. My earrings still in. But I sat at the edge of the bed for a long time, corsageless now, no longer part of the evening. And then, slowly, I unpinned the rest of the day. The box had been small, No ribbon, just matte paper folded cleanly around the edges and secured with a thin seal. I had placed it on the gift table myself, tucked quietly among larger parcels wrapped in white and silver foil. Cards with glittering calligraphy and envelopes. Sealed with wax, it did not stand out. There was no name on the outside, no elaborate handwriting. Just a simple note inside that read, "For when the noise quiets. For when the mirrors are yours again." I don't know when she opened it. Perhaps that night, once the guests had gone and the music had dimmed. Or maybe not until the next morning, when her veil was folded neatly into a box and her hair no longer held its shape inside. She would have found something old. Not in the traditional sense, not a handkerchief or a piece of lace passed down, but old in memory, a pressed poppy. Fragile, carefully framed behind glass, flattened, nearly translucent. Its color faded but still clinging to some shade of red dot. It came from the field near the house where we lived when she was a child, a place we walked every spring. She used to pick them, only for them to wilt by the time we reached home. This one I had saved quietly. Pressed between pages of a forgotten book, unmentioned for years, next to it, folded with care, was a copy of the drawing she had made when she was 6, her and I standing beneath a lopsided tree. Both of us smiling the same wide, boxy smile. She had used red crayon for my dress, and I had pinned it on the refrigerator until it curled at the edges. I had kept it long after that. Dot in the bottom of the box was a note. Only a few lines. No matter how far we drift, I remember. Even when I am quiet, I remember. Even when I am not. In the photos, I remember. I don't know how she reacted. Whether she cried, or laughed softly, or set it aside with barely a second thought. Whether it stirred something or nothing at all. That's the thing about gifts given without spectacle. You don't always get to see how they land. You don't get applause. You don't get reassurances. You just offer. Quietly. Not to change anything, not to earn anything, just because love, even worn thin and stretched across years, still wants a place to go. And sometimes you send it folded in silence. Sometimes you give it without being asked. Sometimes you give it knowing you may never be thanked, but you give it anyway. The next morning arrived without fanfare. The sun filtered in through the blinds, casting quiet lines across the floor. My dress from the night before was still draped across the armchair, holding the shape of where I had last laid it. The house smelled faintly of rosewater and lavender detergent, familiar still. I turned my phone over on the nightstand. No messages, no missed calls. I hadn't expected much. A thank you, maybe? A photo from the reception. A single line text. Did you get home okay? Something small. Something that could be read quickly and forgotten quickly, but still said, you were part of this. But the screen stayed blank. I padded into the kitchen, bare feet cold against the tile. I boiled water, poured tea, and sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the neighbor's sprinklers kicked on. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Life was, as always, moving. I imagined her morning. Maybe they were still at the hotel. Maybe she was still in the dress, hair half fallen from its pins, laughing with her new husband over cake crumbs and gift wrap. Or maybe they had already checked out. Already begun the next thing. My phone remained silent. At noon, I checked again. At 3, again. I read over the note I had written days earlier, the one I nearly included with the gift, the one that simply said, I hope you feel seen today. But I had folded it away at the last minute. It had felt too pointed, too much, too personal. For a day that had so little room for anything unscripted. By evening, I had stopped checking altogether. Not out of resentment, just quiet acceptance. The message wasn't coming. There would be no moment of retroactive invitation, no photo sent with a caption like, you looked beautiful, or I'm glad you were there. No mention of the flower that didn't match, or the seat by the exit, or the gift opened when no one else was around. It's strange, the ache that silence can leave. Not because it's loud, but because it confirms what you suspected but didn't. Want to believe, that you were shone but not quite included, that you were present but not quite presentable, that you were loved perhaps in theory but not in the way that would have made room. I didn't cry. There was no great unraveling. It's just a slow softening. A quiet settling into the fact that this, too, would be part of the story. Not just the wedding, but the silence that followed. It's a space where a message could have been. The absence of words that might have carried something forward. And even so I made dinner, I watered the plants, I folded laundry and set aside a card I had forgotten to give her aunt. Life continued. As it always does, and somewhere deep down, I still held hope that perhaps the message would come later, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. One line, one word, even just. I know the mirror above the dresser had always been kind to me. Not because it hid anything, but because it reflected softly. It was the sort of glass that didn't sharpen your lines or amplify tiredness. Just a quiet, aged mirror with a frame I had refinished myself years ago, when the house still smelled of glue sticks and macaroni dinners. And the floor creaked under the weight of a little girl running barefoot through every room. That morning, after the wedding, I stood in front of it longer than usual. My makeup had worn off in patches. My hair was flattened slightly on one side. There was a faint smudge of lipstick still clinging to the edge of my mouth. The corsage was gone. The dress hung loose now, unzipped at the back. One strap slipping from my shoulder, and there I was. Not mother of the bride. Not a guest. Not the silent woman in the corner, or the one who handed over the carefully wrapped box. Just me. The woman who stayed up late sewing the hem that no one saw. The one who pressed a poppy years ago, not knowing why she couldn't throw it out. One who had been asked not to speak, not out of cruelty, maybe, but out of discomfort. The one who had complied because that's what she always did. I had said nothing. And in saying nothing, I had given something far heavier than a speech. I had handed over silence, and now, looking in the mirror, I wondered why I had agreed to it. Not in anger, but in question. I thought of all the times I had dimmed myself slightly, bit my tongue, stepped back, adjusted to fit someone else's moment. Not just her wedding, but the 100 other moments before it. Her birthdays, her decisions, her sudden silences. Was that what motherhood had taught me? To take up less space, so she could feel unburdened by mine. The woman in the mirror didn't look broken. She didn't even look sad. She looked like someone who had waited too long to ask herself where she'd gone. For a long time, I didn't move. I just watched, not judging, not fixing, just witnessing. It felt in a way like the truest thing I had done all weekend. Eventually, I reached for a tissue and wiped the last of the lipstick away. I pulled the strap back onto my shoulder, then let it fall again. There was no hurry to dress, no camera waiting, no speech left to give. But there was me, unedited, unframed, undirected, in a quiet room. In a quiet house, in a mirror that had no reason to lie, and for the first time in a long time, I nodded to her. Not in approval, not in apology, just in recognition. She was still here, even if no one else had said her name.